Okay, good morning. You should have got an email yesterday afternoon telling you what group you're in and who else is in it. I would have done that in Canvas, but Canvas won't let me email between different classes. And since you and the 340 folks are all sort of doing the same thing, it was the only way I could figure out how to do it. There's also some sort of a function in Canvas about groups. I've got it set up that way, but to be honest, I haven't had time to figure out how to actually turn that on. So I'm not sure if you guys are seeing that or not. But you should have gotten the email. And what I need you to do is then contact the other folks that are in your doing the same thing on the Pololo project, and between you guys, figure out how you want to sort of pick and choose what parts you want to actually work on. Then let me know. Then I'll tell you exactly what to do in for each of the groups. So yeah, so that should have happened yesterday. So do check, if you haven't checked your emails, check your emails, because you should be in there. Again, that's the only way I could figure out how to do it, was to actually pull emails and then just sort of attach everyone to that. So it's a way for you. Otherwise, there was no way for you guys to get in touch with each other, which sort of defeats the purpose. So let's see. First, I guess, any questions about that? Does that seem straightforward or not?
I'm good on it.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, and again, if you do have any problems or any confusions, be sure and let me know. We just ended up in a situation this last week where one of the administrators here decided to stop service learning for some reason. So we've been doing damage control, trying to figure out how to work around that. I think I figured out well, we're just going to sort of ignore them. We're going to do it anyways. So right now, given the COVID situation, what the St. Louis folks are talking about, we might actually start doing field stream collection in November. And there's two folks in the 340 class that's what they really wanted to do. If and when we start actually going out into the field to do collection, botanical and whatever, those of you that want to do that in lieu of what you're actually doing right now can let me know, and well, I'll let you guys know if and when that's going to happen, what the schedule will look like. But if that's really of interest to you, then what we'll do is basically the time that you spend doing this part, the virtual part of the project, will count for part of what you're doing for the service. And then if you actually get involved in doing the actual field part, that'll be another part of it. So don't not do this hoping that we might be out in the field. I plan on being out in the field, but to be honest, things are so screwed up and people are such numbnuts. I wouldn't be too surprised if the entire situation devolves back in a week or two, because everyone thinks things are back to pre-COVID or something. So I'm not planning on it actually happening. Okay, so where we ended up last time, as I remember, World War II, the US military has taken over the Hawaiian Islands. For all intents and purposes, we become a war zone, which basically means we're a military base. So as far as the military is concerned and the federal government is concerned, there's no difference between being on Oahu and being in the Philippines or in Guam or some other place. It's part of the war zone. So we're completely controlled by the US military until basically the end of 1944. So for basically 3 years, Hawaii is subject entirely to military control. And it made sense at the time. We were obviously the first place attacked by the Japanese in World War II. We're the only major U.S. possession, that's actually directly attacked. That's a major size. Guam gets taken over. Of course, the Philippines get taken over by the Japanese, but they were not military centerpieces like Hawaii was. So when World War II is going on, the military basically says, well, the Hawaiian Islands are absolutely necessary for us to successfully project the war back into the rest of the Pacific. And Washington agrees, and because of our territory, that's where it stops. No one ever asked the population here what they wanted, but to be honest, the vast majority of the population was totally in support. So World War II goes on. World War II starts to wind down. It's late 1945. The war basically has moved all the way over. The Japanese home islands are basically being bombed out of existence. And the end result of that is as the war starts to slow down, the frictions between the various folks that were fighting the Germans, Japanese, starts to pop up. And the major friction was between the Europeans and the Soviets, or if you want to, the Europeans and the Russians. They had never been happy partners because in 1939, the Soviets were actually on the side of the Germans when Poland was invaded. So, you know, the Soviets flip-flopped. And the end result is the British, the French, and the other folks in Western Europe really, really distrusted the Soviets. And to be honest, given what a, you know, nutcase Stalin was, it would make perfect sense. He actually had plans to, after Germany surrendered, to move into Western Europe and take over everything, including France, if he could get away with it. The Europeans realized this. And so basically, one of the things that doesn't really get talked about very much here, though you do get it discussed in Europe, is the fact that when World War II starts to wind down, when Germany's getting ready to surrender, for example, the Europeans actually are remobilizing because they think there's going to be another sort of like World War II and a half. And this is going to be a war between the Europeans and the Soviet Union. And they actually design things for that. And the Americans know they're going to get drawn into it, and they've decided the Soviets are, you know, nutcases too. There's a huge amount of paranoia about Bolshevism, which nowadays is called communism, but they're not quite the same thing. And of course, the Soviet Union was the main, you know, practitioner of that particular political philosophy and was very big on exporting it. So they were doing the most that they possibly could to destabilize Europe. And they were also trying to, in some cases, sort of destabilize the United States with you know, Bolshevik political movements. And of course, everyone else was doing pushback and all this. So when World War II ends, if you're standing around in, you know, late 1945, you don't see it the way we see it now in 2020. In your view, World War II isn't really ending. It's almost like a, you know, like a timeout between the first half and the second half of a game. The first half would be the war against Germany and Japan. The second half would be the war against the Soviet Union. So what happens is Germany surrenders, that war doesn't quite start out, but again, everyone's tiptoeing around there. There's a whole mess of weird stuff that goes on for the next 4 or 5 years in Europe between the Soviets and the Europeans. And one of the side effects of that is in the Pacific here is Japan surrenders. The Soviets had actually had neutrality with Japan till almost 6 weeks before the war ends, at which point the Soviets invade, take over all of North China, take over most of Korea, take over all the eastern islands, and the Japanese change, so it's called the Sakhalins and the Kurils. And they're getting ready to invade Hokkaido. So when World War II ends in Japan, it wasn't what people had thought it was going to be 3 months earlier. 3 months earlier, the Soviet Union was just sort of sitting there like a lump, and it was going to be the Americans and the Australians vis-a-vis the Japanese. All of a sudden, when World War II ends, the Soviets are parked all around the edge here. They've taken over all this part of China, Korea. They're getting ready to invade northern Japan. And in fact, the Soviet impact was one of the main reasons the Japanese surrendered, as much, if not more so, than the nuclear weapons, because the Soviet Union's attacking on the Japanese islands was genocidal. When the Soviets took over the Sakhalins, they killed all the Japanese on there. They told the Japanese if they were going to invade Hokkaido, they're going to kill the Japanese in Hokkaido too. So they were just going to get rid of the Japanese population and take over islands. And that's one of the main reasons the Japanese surrendered, because the Soviets were already doing it and they knew they would do it. So when Japan surrenders, all of a sudden, especially for the Americans, the world is really different than what they thought it was going to be 2 months earlier. Because now, you know, 2 months earlier, they thought, oh, well, the Soviet Union and Europeans are going to go at it. But that's like, you know, it's like 10,000 miles away. Who cares? Now, all of a sudden, at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union is parked right on the front doorstep. They're taking over the same areas the Japanese had. And they're not that far, one, from Alaska. They're just right across the Bering Straits. And secondly, is they're actually not that far from the west coast of the United States. So it's almost like you traded one enemy for another. Yeah, you just got rid of this huge, bloody, nasty war with the Japanese, and then all of a sudden, bang, now you got the Soviet Union that walks, talks, and sounds almost like the same as the Japanese, that they really hate the United States, they really da-da-da-da. And, you know, and so basically it's sort of like, you know, Jesus, what the hell happened? And this is really important to Hawaii, because what happens is when World War II ends, if you remember all those things that the military had written up, so they take over. They take over all the property around, well, they take over Pearl Harbor, they take over all the property around Pearl Harbor, which was all privately owned. They take over this huge chunk around Schofield, all the way over to the mountains on either side, which again was all privately owned, or owned by the state, or territory, I should say. So they had taken over all these enormous amounts of property, Bellows out here, all these huge amounts of property. Of course, Makaha, and your small valleys up here. And so what happens is everyone was under the assumption, because what the military had told them is when World War II ends, in other words, when Japan surrenders, we'll give you back almost all of this property. And to be honest, that's actually what the military probably intended in 1942 when they signed those things. And that's what everyone thought. And that's one reason why people didn't get paid, because one, they were being patriotic, and two, there's the assumption the United States is borrowing property. They're not going to keep it, they're just borrowing it for a couple of years. When the war ends and we've won the war, then we'll try to go sort of back to normal. With Russia or the Soviet Union replacing Japan, what happens is we never go back to normal. If you go back to your world history, maybe like you did in high school or something like that, we end up in what's usually called the Cold War period, which the only difference between a Cold War and a hot war is a Cold War, you don't shoot each other directly, but otherwise the tensions are exactly the same. So what you end up post-World War II is the replacement of an active war with a attitudinal war that goes on right into the 1990s. Because of that fear of the Soviets in the Pacific, which very quickly, of course, by 1950 erupts in the Korean War. And then, of course, 1949, China gets taken over by the Chinese communists. And so, you know, it just keeps on spinning and spinning with these ever increasing what appears to be Soviet influences in Asia. And so more and more the United States gets incredibly paranoid. There is going to be another war, and it's going to be like tomorrow, and it's going to be in the Pacific. And so in that situation, the military decides that that little piece of paper they've given all of you guys, if you're landowners, for example, around here, is the war hasn't ended. Now, of course, technically the war did end. There was a surrender. They're going to celebrate that, and I think, or else they already did. I can't remember when the war ends in World War II. But for the military's view of things, the war never actually finished. The war just sort of did a halftime. And so in that context, they keep almost all the property they acquired in World War II. Now, this just absolutely ruins a huge number of families, because most of this area here was controlled by Japanese fishermen, but there are also a ton of fish ponds in here. All of Pearl Harbor is just a massive number of fish ponds. There's roughly 27 fish ponds in Pearl Harbor. About 6 of those were actually sort of being used. People were catching fish offshore, bringing them in, storing them here, and then selling them to the stores. And it made the great advantage the fish were still alive when you sold them. So there are a bunch of people that made their living. They had their boats over here in Harbor Town, and they were using this whole part of the harbor for either for fishing for nehu or, you know, raising fish or all sorts of stuff. So this is a very important part of the economic center of Honolulu, was what was going on here. 1942, wham, it's all in the hands of the military, and everyone's sort of going, okay, we'll just hold on. It's like the COVID thing. Okay, we just got to hold on for a little while, then things will go back to normal. And all of a sudden, the little while turns into a little longer little while. Pretty soon it's a longer little while. Here, the little while that was supposed to be a couple of years kept on going. No one here has ever got reimbursed for the property that was taken from them in 1942. So there's a ton of families that basically are walking around with a piece of paper that now is really yellowed, and it's, you know, it's probably worth more as a historical artifact to sell on eBay than it's worth as a legal document. Because the military argues that for the defense of the United States, they have to keep these properties. And at some point, when it goes to federal court, you can't argue that, because the Department of Defense, their job is to decide what is necessary to protect the United States. And if someone like Maddie says, well, you know, my property here isn't necessary for the United States, and I want it back, you guys took it, you said you were going to give back in 1945. I mean, what the hell? It's now 1970. I mean, dude, you know, the war's power. We're friends with the Japanese now, so why you still got my property? And they're just going to tell her, hey, you know, because of our view, our assessment of threat, there's still threats to the United States, and therefore, you know, you're just going to suck when we're going to keep your property. So the end result of all this is none of this ever gets reimbursed. Now it gets very, very bizarre, and this is certainly true for this whole section here and the section over here. In fact, the subdivision here is that what happens is the military, especially in the 60s and 70s, now remember they didn't pay for this property, but they've got it. They've got title to it. What they do is they then put it up to auction and sell it and make money out of it. So for a lot of the areas around Pearl Harbor, you actually have families that owned property until 1942. They were given a temporary borrowing agreement, if you want to think of it that way. The military says we need to keep it, but especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the military did this just again last year, is the military then auctions off this property saying we own it, and then sells it to someone else. So you get a developer that puts in a golf course or something over here. They paid the military for the land, But the original landowners sort of standing in the back of the room, sort of raising their hand. Well, excuse me, you know, we actually own this property. You know, it's going to just tell them tough shit. So one of the weirdest aspects of all this is what originally was supposed to be a temporary state of affairs to make sure that we won the war. Turned out initially to be, I would say probably through the late 40s, the military was doing it with the best of intentions. They really thought there was going to be another war. But somewhere after that, they got really comfortable with the fact that they owned the land. And now they treat it as if it's their property. They know, and they argue that there's, for example, a statute of limitations on the taking of property, which is totally not true under U.S. law. But they win those cases in court because every time it comes up, they just say, well, the Department of Defense has decided that this was needed for the American war effort and to protect the people of the United States. But then what happens is all of a sudden they auction the property off. And you're so like, well, what does that have to do with the people of the United States? You auction to some developer for a golf course. So the military, as I mentioned last time, is the huge player in Hawaii in the 20th century. And because they control so much of the highly valuable real estate, it makes them an enormous force that's really out of proportion to, you know, their size of the population. And they still own enormous portions of the Hawaiian Islands. All this section up here belongs to the military. They own everything, including the only other access to the Waianae coast, which is through the road across the Waianae Mountains into Lu'u'u'ulei. So you've got the military just controls a staggering amount of the part of the area of Oahu. All this, in fact, all this section of Lu'u'u'ulei used to be a military. In fact, it still is a military installation. So the enormous parts of the Hawaiian Islands, especially the island of Oahu, are controlled by the military. Now, the other thing that happens with the military properties is they took over almost any place that didn't have a lot of people in it. And they used that for live weapons training or live fire training. So they would send people, for example, over here into this valley. And what they would do is, especially in Makua Valley over here, I'll use both of them, they would send people up in here because that would allow them to do jungle training. So you have folks from the mainland United States that have never seen a subtropical environment, have never had to deal with heat and humidity like we've got here. And so what you would do is you made all the areas in the Hawaiian Islands that were possibly useful into areas where you could train folks how to fight in a jungle, how to fight in the rest of the Pacific. To do that successfully, you had to use things that go boom, because you have to be able to sort of recreate or simulate a real fight with, for example, the Japanese. So what happened is places like Makua, where I used to do a lot of work over in Kahana on the other side, all these places were taken over by the military in World War II. And in most cases, they used large amounts of weapons and explosives and stuff to basically practice invading other islands. Now, when World War II ends, they keep most of these because they think they might use it again. By the 1950s, 1960s, they start to cough the valleys up because they really don't have any use for them. By then, we're getting into missiles and tanks and stuff like that, so they really didn't think they needed them. So they for example, give Kahana Valley back to the territory and back to the landowners. But everything that they did in terms of explosives and stuff like that were still there. When we were doing work in the Kahana, we surveyed the whole valley, and there's still part of a tank in one part of the valley. We found 5 different caches of mortar rounds, which are 81 millimeter rounds that were live. So, I mean, you find this all over the place. If you ever go diving off of Waianae, there's shit all over the place out there. If you ever go into Makaha, there's still 2 choppers in Makaha from practice in the Vietnam period. And there's still parts of a tank. And again, there's at least 5 or 6 areas where there's live ammunition still in Makaha Valley that was, you know, that the military just sort of left when they were doing work there in the 40s, 50s, 60s, or whatever. And then they just sort of give the valley back, but they don't clean it up. And the military's, when you ask them that, they basically say, well, it was too expensive. And we don't have records of where we left stuff. So it would take so much time, so much manpower, and so much money to find all the stuff that was left behind that we're just basically, their attitude is, you should be happy that we gave it back to you. The ranch I do a lot of work on over here. Ulupalakua Ranch controls all this part of Maui, southeast Maui. They used all of this section from here all the way over to here for live fire training. Both planes coming in with missiles and guns, artillery, mortars, the whole 9 yards. The ranch still, it's gone down, but into the 1990s, the ranch was still losing 1 to 5 cattle a year from them stepping on bombs. And I remember once we were doing some work over in here, and all of a sudden there's this big whoomp in the distance, and it was down over here. And then, one of the guys said, "Oh, stepped on a missile." And sure enough, there was a small crater in what was left of a cow, and it stepped on a 3.5-inch missile that had probably been fired in 1944. This whole area is just totally littered. If you work in a lot of the Hawaiian Islands, you get very used to looking for the leftover remnants of military rounds. It's just part of the cost of doing business in Hawaii is if you're in the rural areas, you're walking on explosives. You're walking on unexploded ordnance from World War II all the way through the Korean or Vietnam War. And the military doesn't clean any of that up. Their attitude is, well, they originally needed to use this space for national defense. You should be happy you're getting the land back, so don't give us a hard time about what we did or didn't do. And of course, the most famous of these cases would be Kaho'olawe, as we'll see later, which was used for everything up through battleship cannon and all sorts of stuff like that. I've done work in Kaho'olawe and ended up having lunch sitting on a 12-inch artillery round that I didn't realize till the unexploded, the Marine ordnance guys pointed out to me I was actually sitting on a live shell, which is probably why I got white hair. So what you get is this is part of doing work in the Hawaiian Islands, is the military's impact is still around in 2020. There's been a big discussion in the last year or two off of Waianae, where they found a big cache of explosives offshore. And there was also a big cache of fortunately empty gas containers for poison gas that the military just dumped offshore somewhere in the 40s, 50s, or early 60s because they just felt like getting rid of it. But this is true of all the islands. All the islands are absolutely covered in military crap, for lack of a better term, that is a result of the World War II and post-World War II activities. On the US mainland, almost everything was given up right at the end of World War II. So, I mean, they took over large parts of San Francisco, San Diego, all these other areas for the same reason they did in Hawaii. When World War II ended, they gave all those areas back because, one, they were states, so there was a lot of pressure to do so. Those folks voted, and they were visible, and you didn't want to piss them off. Because Hawaii was a territory, the military, of course, had always been the big spender of money. The military sort of, I would say, right into the 1960s, really saw the Hawaiian Islands as sort of being their property. So, if you wanted something here, you sort of went hand in hand and asked them, oh, by the way, I really hate to bother you, but could you da-da-da-da-da? And in most cases, they just tell you, like, no. And there's still some of that. The Navy still tends to act like that more than occasionally. The Army's been acting like that in terms of the maneuver ranges for the Stryker Brigade up in Schofield. And certainly in Makua, which is still a huge bone of contention between the military and especially Hawaiian groups, but generally the Waianae side of the Waianae Coast population. So this stuff doesn't disappear. There's a big amount of pressure on the Big Island because one of the huge areas the military takes over in 1942 is Pohakaloa. And it's always been sort of intriguing to me with all the discussion about Mauna Kea and what's going on there, that hasn't spilled over to a more aggressive attitude about the fact that the military controls everything in this entire area. And they do a huge amount of live fire training there. And there are a number of sacred Hawaiian sites in there. So I mean, the military's been a very uncomfortable roommate, I guess would be the best way to phrase it, here in Hawaii. But they are enormous.
Did you hear about yesterday? They had a hearing because the military had to rewrite the environmental impact statement for their use of Pohakaloa, and they were supposed to have like a town hall about it yesterday. And so I think they were expecting like a live town hall thing, but basically the military pre-recorded their presentation, so there was like no room for like community members to even have input. So then they were blowing up the phone lines and like trying to call and give their statements and stuff. But yeah, that I was just thinking about it when you were talking about Pohakaloa. But
oh yeah, no. I mean, I've worked with the military off and on. Actually, one of my jobs when I first moved to Oahu was we were actually working with the Navy trying to figure out a way for them to give up Kaho'olawe cleanly. That was my first experience working with the Navy, and I tell you that, yeah, I've been working with the military ever since then, and they're frustrating, to put it mildly. But yeah, I mean what you're saying is a classic example of that arrogance. From the military standpoint, they're just being clever. They pre-record it, and that way they don't really have to care what anyone says afterwards, but they can still say they did it. But if on the other hand, you really want to live with a group of people and deal with that group of people, that's probably the fastest way to piss off folks in the Big Island you could possibly imagine. Because you're basically telling them, we don't care what you have to say. Here's what we're going to say. That's, yeah. I mean, one would think in 2020 that there might be a little more attempt to be a little more aware of the fact that we're all part of the United States and Hawaii is a state. The folks that live here are citizens of the United States, but yeah, I know. I mean, and there's a lot of folks in the military that don't like the way the military handles stuff, but the military decision-making establishment, I'm not sure they've really changed that much from the 70s when I had to deal with them, and that's not a compliment, to put it mildly. Yeah, because one of my best friends actually did work for 20 years for the military out at Schofield, and I had to listen to him every week, complain about the guys he had to work with in terms of the military decision-making, not at Shafter. Yeah, I hadn't heard that one, but I have to admit, it's like, yeah, that's like somewhere in my list of not a big surprise. So what you get here, and as we'll see later when we get into the whole issue of Oahu, probably the absolutely central piece of all this is Pearl Harbor. And the Navy, my view, actually the Marines, in most cases, they get a little silly sometimes, but the Marines have actually been pretty good at dealing with the population around them. They're not really great at it, but they're pretty good. The Army's gone from good to bad to good to bad. There's periods of time where the Army's actually been a really good, part of the island of Oahu, and especially in the Leeward Coast, in the Waianae Coast region. And there's other times where they just get mental. The Navy, on the other hand, has a pretty long established history of basically thinking the Hawaiian Islands belong to them. And they still have a lot of that. If you ever deal with the Navy, even here in 2020, or I had to deal with last year in 2019, it's still sort of like, well, we need this place. And if you ask them, well, why? Well, we might need it. And it's like, dude, if work happens, you can always claim the whole Hawaiian Islands again, just like you did in 1941. You don't get to stash huge amounts of property because you might want it someday. That's sort of like renting 3 things in public storage because you might want to use them, and that means someone else doesn't get them. And they just don't see the world that way, because the military mentality, especially at senior levels of decision making, is really different than anyone else's. Now, what gets very complicated here, and this is just some stats from you. They're a little bit old, but they're still pretty much the same. The number of actually military dependents shot up. I believe now it's 126,000. So still, as of today, military and military dependents are 1/10 of the total population here on the island of Oahu. I should point out that one of the big things that got everyone really hot till about a month and a half ago is military and military dependents were not subject to the COVID restriction orders. So at the same time that if you were anyone even coming back here to come back home, you had to stay 14 days in quarantine. If you were military or military dependent until early September, you could just do whatever you wanted to do. So they were not under the same regulations anywhere else was, because they were Department of Defense. Now, for active military personnel, it sort of makes sense, but for military dependents, that's a lot more sketchy. So I mean, this even in this last year, the military's idea that somehow they are different than everyone else, and anyone that is involved in the military is different than anyone else, is still very much in charge. One of the things they very cleverly started doing in the 70s and 80s, after they lost the Kaho'olawe court cases, which basically said the military was responsible. In this case, the Navy was responsible for cleaning up Kaho'olawe. They were able to sort of twidge their way out of that in some ways. Is that they were then told that they have to do 2 things. One is they have to do an environmental impact statement for all their federal military properties in the Hawaiian Islands. The Army and the Marines got their EISs done in 1996. The Navy has never finished an environmental impact statement for Pearl Harbor as of 2020. 3 times the U.S. Supreme Court has told them to do so. Twice the President of the United States, who's the Commander-in-Chief, has told them to finish it within a year. And all those were within 20 years ago. The Navy just refuses to do it. They're not going to do it. We know from water testing that Pearl Harbor is one of the most toxic water collection facilities in the United States. It has some of the highest lead rates of any place in the United States, more so than you would find outside of a lead mine in, say, Pennsylvania. So the waters in Pearl Harbor are actually toxic. They can kill you. The U.S. Navy says that it's not. The U.S. Navy will tell you they haven't completed the testing, therefore they can't comment on that. Ironically, the Department of Agriculture and other federal agencies actually have it listed as a toxic site. The Navy's been collecting money for Pearl Harbor as a Superfund toxic site. So they've been getting money to clean it up, but then they're not using the money to clean it up because they argue that they're not sure how dirty it is. That's very typical of a whole mess of stuff, but it's also what was happening by the 1970s with a sort of change in attitude, that it was really convenient to have property in Hawaii. So the military really didn't want to give it up, even though they didn't have a justifiable excuse anymore. Especially by the 1970s, the chance of war with the Soviet Union had dropped off tremendously. And of course, as of now, there is no Soviet Union. There's Russia, but it's hard to argue that you have the same scenario playing out now that you did say in 1955. So, the military's justification for keeping properties which were confiscated is really sketchy now. What they did in a lot of areas, especially when the decision came, they were supposed to clean up areas that had ordnance on them, is rather than doing what they were supposed to, is they gave them to Hawaii National Guard, which is technically it's a weird thing. It's, on one hand, it's Department of Defense, but on the other hand, it's also state. And so what happened is all of a sudden the Hawaii National Guard found itself with literally about 14 values in the Hawaiian Islands, where it controls the firing ranges. It doesn't have a penny to clean up the ordnance. But in doing so, the Department of Defense has been arguing to the courts that it's not their property anymore. So therefore, they're not responsible for cleaning it up. They're trying to dump it back on the state of Hawaii. It's estimated Makua alone would take probably about $400 million to clean up. To do the final cleanup of Kaho'olawe, and then with about, I think it's $140 million, the military was able to clean up 10% of the island. They estimate it would take roughly $4 billion to clean up the rest of Kaho'olawe. And that doesn't include any of the other valleys. So it's just, it's completely off the chart. They're just not going to do it. It's too much money. And they just don't see it as being relevant. One of the most telling factors of all this, if you actually measure usable land, the state of Hawaii is the largest landowner in the state. But that's, of course, is the back of all the valleys. That's all the ridges. So it's not usable land. The largest usable land owner in the Hawaiian Islands is the Department of Defense. That's totally out of whack with every other place in the United States. Even places like Nevada, where the military is a big presence, do not have that much land that are controlled by the military versus total acreage. Here in Hawaii, it's completely off the charts. In many ways, if you look at it statistically, we're actually a military reservation that happens to have civilians around the edges compared to the rest of the US. And the important thing here is what you don't see is the other agencies. There aren't large amounts of property controlled by the National Forest Service or Department of Agriculture or even housing or anything like that. Those agencies are largely not present here in Hawaii. It's Department of Defense. So for example, most of our federally rated public housing is actually military dependent housing, around places like Pearl Harbor or Schofield. It's not the type of housing you see in most of the rest of the United States. So even as of 2020, what you find is the military is still the other huge presence here in Hawaii. And something that always have to, if you're dealing with any sort of issue environmentally or socially, they're going to come into it somewhere. And they're generally in it right from the get-go. So if you're ever involved in environmental stuff, you will be dealing with the military, I can guarantee it. It's just a matter of how, when, or why. So get used to it, I guess. 1959, a big change, well, sort of a big change occurs. We're not going to get the whole issue about statehood and plebiscite voting and stuff like that in terms of whether we have choice. Basically, in 1959, they do a vote, and you're told you can either remain a territory or you can become a state. Not surprising, the majority of the population votes for statehood. There's never any discussion had about whether you should return to the monarchy or something like that, which actually under international law is illegal, by the way. They should have had that vote. What happens, though, and most importantly, is when we become a state, that shifts our relationship with Washington. Prior to that, everything was done in Washington. Governors are appointed in Washington. The people we have sitting in Congress don't have votes. The people in Hawaii really didn't vote in national elections, even though they were technically citizens. So what happened to us is we were irrelevant. And that's one reason the military was able to do what it did here, is because right till 1959, no one could complain, basically. It's like, you're just in someone else's house. 1959 was statehood, then all that changes. Hawaii then has more ability to make its own choices in terms of now it's a state, so like every other state, it can modify such, et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, of course, as of today, even today in 2020, we're absolutely irrelevant when it comes to national elections. The population here is so small. If there was any national election where we changed it, that would undoubtedly be challenged by everyone for like the next 40 years afterwards. And especially the way that it's set up with the electoral board. We're irrelevant. I think we're only one vote in the electoral board or something like that. So at the national level, national politicians don't care what we think. We're off the charts. You're never going to see Trump or Biden come over here and pound on the pavement trying to get folks here to vote for him, because it's a waste of their time. It's a lot more useful to go to LA or Seattle or someplace else where there's a lot of folks in a major important state. We're we're not only unimportant, we're almost non-existent. Now, what that means is we're very limited in terms of being able to control national influence in Hawaii. Things still happen very much like they did as a territory. The mainland decides something and it happens here. People here can moan and groan about it, but it's not going to make the changes. The center of gravity is still in Washington, D.C. One of the other things that happens, and it's really sort of creepy in some ways, and it really sort of irritates those of us that have been here for a long time, or most of you probably, is when you go to the mainland, you realize that the mainland view of here is one, that there were not a state, and two, in many cases, they're still sort of surprised. This really says something about American total lack of geography knowledge, is in many cases, Americans are still shocked that Hawaii is actually part of the United States. They don't know what we are, but they see us as being somehow totally different. Now, of course, this has been heavily marketed in many ways because this is one of the main bases for tourism. One of the reasons that tourism is so successful here is it's very easy to get on a plane in LA or Chicago or something like that, and you fly to exotic paradise Hawaii, and it's totally different than the United States. And it's really creepy when you talk to folks. You know, last time I was doing this was last year, where I was interacting with some tourists, and especially the older folks, but especially the folks in your age group, especially the under 25 group, were sort of wondering whether their debit cards would work in Hawaii. And in fact, one girl who was, I think, 19 was asking me, yeah, do we have to do currency exchange here? I'm sort of like, dude, I mean, what the hell, you know? But, you know, that's still the mainland's attitude. We're not part of the mainland United States, and therefore we're not really part of the United States. Now, ironically, that, of course, actually works to the advantage of the tourism industry, because then they can market Hawaii as being exotic and different, and it's painless because the mainland already has that attitude. On the other hand, what you see starting, especially in the 1980s, and of course, it's just become ever more powerful, especially with the post-COVID impacts, is that more and more what happens by the 70s and 80s, and especially with statehood and sort of the integrating of legal systems, is that you see a massive increase in mainland consumption and mainland businesses, whether they be banks, whether they be retail, whatever, where more and more what were sort of local industry becomes subsumed under mainland, or even in some cases global change. One of the most striking here that gets almost no press for some reason is the fact that the two largest local real estate companies have been bought out by massive mainland conglomerates in the last 2 years. One, because the real estate market here is so good, and two, just because they could. And so what you find is that, as with many other things, the decision-making process actually isn't then someone who has their money invested here at Hawaii. So the real estate companies till 2 years ago were owned by folks who were born and raised here, and most of their staff was from here. And so therefore they were, you know, when they were making choices or decisions, it would be based on the fact that, well, you know, I'm from here, my company's here, et cetera, et cetera. Now in both those cases, one is actually based in Ottawa, Canada, and the other is based in New York. So they have absolutely no interest in Hawaii. And if they want to lay off most of the realtors here because they want to bring in folks from somewhere else or whatever, that's entirely their prerogative, and they'll just do it, because there's very little connection between a lot of the economic activity that goes on in Hawaii and the local folks that live here or work in them. You know, and so that's, I mean, a good example would be Hawaiian Air. Hawaiian Air is actually an LA or San Francisco, I think, no, San Francisco-based operation. So on one hand, they're from Hawaii, but the decisions they make are actually based on you know, a set of parameters in which Hawaii is just one factor, in some cases a pretty minor factor. So in that context, this is one of the huge changes that occurred. Now, one of the side effects of this, you can actually have, and a good example would be both Barnes and Noble, but especially Sears, was when Sears started to go under. The Sears stores here in Hawaii were actually doing quite well. But when Sears imploded on the mainland, it took those stores down here with them. Because what you're part of is a larger national or international conglomerate. It doesn't matter how well you're doing here. It's the sum total of all of those. So all of a sudden, stores where folks were actually being very good at selling and buying stuff still find themselves out of business because of this larger entity. This was very much a post-statehood thing. Prior to statehood, almost everything that was going on here was based locally. It was locally, if you want to call it locally owned. I would argue here in 2020, almost nothing is locally owned anymore. Even a lot of the places that advertise themselves as local are actually local franchises of large mainland chains. So that's one of the enormous economic changes that happens. The last of these is by the 1980s, 1990s, because in a weird sort of synergy of both of these. On one hand, the view that Hawaii is different than the mainland United States. combined with the fact that you now have your mainland institutions, whether it be financial institutions, retail, whatever it is, are actually part of the United States mainland. What happens is it makes Hawaii incredibly attractive at the national level and later international level as an investment market. And so what you find, for example, right now, a friend of mine just sent me a note from some real estate company in Portland, Oregon, which was trying to convince their investors, in other words, people to buy real estate as investments versus to live in a house, that they should invest in Hawaii rather than Oregon because the political destabilization in places like Portland was going to continue and get worse and the value of property was going to drop. In fact, they argued it is dropping. So therefore, it makes more sense to invest in Honolulu or Lahaina or Lanikai or something like that, because that's a more stable investment market because it's separated by 2,500 miles of ocean from the turmoil on the US mainland. You see that discussion a lot. That also happens a lot at the international level. Koreans, especially Chinese, right now because of the political instability in China. You see tons of Chinese trying to buy into Hawaii and get their money out of wherever country they are because they see Hawaii as being a more stable investment market. Because the weird thing is these stereotypes that have been generated over the last century and a half about Hawaii being exotic and different and the whole view of stereotypes of Hawaiians and such like that. And yet it has all the conveniences of the mainland, make Hawaii one of the most incredibly attractive investment markets in the world, which is one reason why it's so expensive when you guys go out and look for something, is simply because everyone else on the planet sees Hawaii as a great place to stash their cash. And they do that by virtue of buying property or investing in stuff. So especially in the last 20, 30 years, and it's, you guys, this year is rapidly growing even more so than it did the last 5 years. Even with COVID and everything being shut down, you find mainland investors actually calling up businesses here and trying to buy into a business that's afraid they're going to go bankrupt because they, till yesterday they couldn't do anything. And the mainland guys, well, I don't care. You're still safer than me having a business in Chicago or in Seoul, Korea. So what you find is Hawaii now is actually on the international map. Hawaii is probably one of the 2 or 3 top places to put your money in the entire planet. And that has huge implications for us because none of this money is our money. None of this money has anything to do with us unless we work for those people, but it doesn't have anything to do with the value of this place to the people who live here. It's all a perceived external value from the rest of the planet. That doesn't look like that's going to change. If anything, I would argue in the next year or two, it's going to get even more sort of amplified. But it has enormous implications for us in terms of sort of consequences to all that. Switch over here. Oh, you're bummer. I didn't have it. Oh, okay. Wait. Come on, you stupid machine. The machine's giving me attitude. Okay, here we go. It's Friday and it wants to go home. Okay. So this segues into the next part of this because this actually is the thing about was actually what I was just talking about. When you look at tourism here, and if you notice this enormous pressure in roughly, what is it, 2 weeks we're supposed to have tourists coming back. Ironically, those tourists should be coming from Asia. That would be the most logical and safest thing to do, but we're not. They're going to be mainland tourists. Why? Because mainland air companies, mainland airlines, are the major investors here. So they're going to make sure that their investments are out from Chicago or California or something like that is the folks that get to go up here first. So be prepared for that. So what happens when you look at tourism? Hawaii tourism is really peculiar. There's a few other places that have somewhat similar situations to ours, but in some ways we're probably the most famous of all of them. And a lot of this goes pretty far back. When the Europeans first start to arrive here in any numbers, now Cook and those guys weren't interested in this stuff, but by 1805, when the French come here, for example, one of the first things they do is they go to the Big Island, they land at Kealakekua Bay, and then a whole group of them hikes all the way up to Mauna Loa and to Kilauea to check out the volcano. The fact that we have active volcanoes that are doing something almost all the time was an enormous source of fascination for Europeans. There's tons of volcanoes on planet Earth, but there's very few places where they're actually doing something most of the time. And there's very few places where they're so visibly a volcano, and yet they're actually safe to take a look at. There's places like Etna in Sicily, but that bugger's blowing up all the time, so there's a good chance you go look at it, you might not make it out. So right from the get-go, there was this enormous fascination with what people saw as a juxtaposition. On one hand, you have an area that looks tropical and it's all green and it's all spectacular. On the other hand, you have live volcanoes erupting steam and lava and all sorts of stuff like that. And so right from the early European explorer period, there's an enormous fascination with the volcanoes, which of course means by translation the Big Island, as far as they saw it. So this actually becomes one of the main things that people did. By the 1820s, 1830s, anyone that came to the Hawaiian Islands, they would usually initially land either in Lahaina or they'd be landing in Honolulu. But one of the things you had to do, and everyone did it, was you got your butt on a boat and you went over to Kealakekua, or later to Hilo side, and you walked up to see the volcano. Volcano House, which is now abandoned right now because of the last sequence of eruptions and stuff, though they're going to rebuild it, was actually one of the first, I think it's the first hotel in the Hawaiian Islands, and one of the first hotels west of the Mississippi River. And it was built there because it's cold and it's usually pretty miserable up there. But everyone wanted to go up there and see the volcano. So it was basically built to house the people who wanted to go up there, make some money off of them. Everyone had to go check the volcano out. Now, on top of that, what very quickly spins out of this, and again, this has to do with Cook and these early explorations, this weird view of Polynesians being sort of exotic European, that whole weird European scenario, is that the other exotic you look at, so volcanoes are one exotic. The other exotic you just have to see is Hawaiians. So right from 1805, 1810, when the Russians land here in 1810, first thing you do is you check out the Hawaiians, and you want to see Hawaiians doing Hawaiian stuff, and the other thing you do is you go to a volcano. And in some ways, it's sad in a weird way, that's still tourism in 2020. So what happens is you don't see a discussion of the population that lives here. What you see is the mainland stereotypes of the people they consider Hawaiians becomes the other exotic. So they want to see one thing that's geology, and they want to see another thing that they see as sort of an exotic Disneyland, Disney World cultural phenomena. And they want both of those. And when they get both of those, they're happy campers. Now, this morphs in a whole mess of different ways in the 19th century as Hawaiians either deal or aren't very happy about this whole thing, and not surprisingly. But it also, as more and more people come over here and more people want this, you then institutionalize both of these. So you institutionalize the idea that the natural here in Hawaii is special and unique. And that's pretty much grounded on the Big Island. You also advertise that what's special and unique is Hawaiians. But you want to do that, if you think about that whole sort of mainland thing, you want to do that from the comfort of things that you're used to. And so the translation of that is the comfort of things that you're used to is within the comfort of a Euro-American type setting. And that's why Waikiki gets built. Waikiki allows Euro-Americans to basically be in a comfortable hotel room in a nice place with water and beach. So it's another part of this whole natural thing. And in that situation, they interact with people they call Hawaiians. They do that at luau's, they do that at Hawaiian hula presentations, the Hilton Hawaiian until the COVID thing, they still were lighting the torches there every night with a guy running around, sort of a fake malo and stuff like that. And that's what tourists have been expecting since the 1840s. And so what happened is Hawaiians became what you came to Hawaii for. You came to Hawaii as much to see people acting out being Hawaiian in the way that you expected them to be, not the way they actually are, but your mainland expectations of them. Now what happens then is by the 1870s, 1880s, this gets very complicated, where it's still the monarchy. So we're still run as a Hawaiian kingdom by Hawaiian chiefs. Having said that, there's then a whole mess of these negative stereotypes about Hawaiians that live now. Oh, they don't have any sense of time, they're lazy, and they want to play and party all the time, et cetera, et cetera. But if you think about it from the tourism sector, that isn't a bad thing. And so what happens is you move from if you want to think what you move from the Hawaiian as farmer, from the Hawaiian as someone who builds and works on things, to the idea of the hula maiden, Duke Kahanamoku, and the Beach Boys teaching folks how to surf and how to paddle a canoe. And yet those folks that are actually doing that, if they are Hawaiian, their parents, and in many cases they themselves were actually farmers maybe in the back of Palolo Valley. But the tourists don't want to see them working. the tourists want to see them playing, because the tourists want to, for a short period of time, have the fantasy of playing, just like Hawaiians do all the time in their stereotype. So what happens is Hawaiians become children to the tourism industry. Hawaiians become happy, friendly, plumeria, flower in the hair, wearing a lei, always smiling, always helpful, and that becomes the stereotype of the Hawaiian. You don't want Hawaiians in 1880 or 1950 or 2020 who act like King Kamehameha. You want the Duke Kahanamoku welcoming Hawaiian. And so this becomes tourism. Tourism is based on a set of stereotypes. Tourism is always based on stereotypes. No one at any tourist destination has anything to say about how they're viewed. The tourist does all that because they're paying the money to go to that place. And so what you get is these dominance of images, which you still see today. This was one reason until even 15 years ago, the huge power of the Polynesian Cultural Center is a place for tourists to go. Why? Because it very explicitly recreated what the tourist fantasy was of this place in a very, very straightforward and sometimes almost innocent view. Let's see, okay. Now I went over before on one of the slides just sort of the basic premises of tourism. What happens is actually between 1890 and the 1930s is the really big change has nothing to do with us, it has to do with technology. By the 1860s through the 1880s, what the huge change is all of a sudden you can do pictures. Prior to this, people had to paint or draw stuff. By the 1860s, people are taking pictures. And very quickly, since pictures usually were actually on glass, is they find ways to fix the glass so that you can keep the picture on the glass and you can project. You guys think of this as a slide. Okay? So by the 1860s, 1870s, you can have slides. Now, the great advantage of a slide is you can sit there and put it in a projector and show it on a wall, and a bunch of people can see it at once. So it's a hell of a lot cheaper than printing out pictures. And what you find is by the 1860s, 1870s, there's a huge business, especially in the eastern part of the United States, of people doing slide presentations about their trip to Hawaii. And people would pay them really good money. And in modern sense, you'd pay someone the modern equivalent maybe $50 to $100 to go and sit in some place and have them show you slides for an hour or two about the Hawaiian experience. And people are just like totally stoked, which gives you something how little else there was probably to do back then. But this became a huge thing because if you're going to do these slideshows, what you have to do is you have to basically reflect these stereotypes. So some of the slides would be of volcanoes. A lot of the slides would be of Hawaiians doing hula or other Hawaiian stuff. Very few of the slides would involve locals or anything like that or work. And so what happens is that just reinforces the stereotype that all these folks already have of us. Now what happens, of course, in the early 20th century is all of a sudden that switches to now moving pictures. They figure out a way to basically take a bunch of slides in a row, and that becomes a movie. And so what happens is it's not by accident. You can actually find this, if I remember, maybe I'll send you the link. In, I think it's 1903 or 1905 or something, one of the first moving pictures ever made is Edison sends one of the crews out here and they take a movie in Hawaii. Now they could have taken that movie on the mainland, they didn't. They spent a huge amount of money shipping a crew over here just to take about 5 or 10 minutes of film in Hawaii, because then they could charge obscene huge amounts of money on the mainland for people to watch that. And someone very cleverly realized that people were going to pay huge amounts of money to watch a movie about Hawaii that they were not going to pay to watch a movie about someone in San Francisco. So we become, when moving pictures come in, we become one of the first places the moving pictures are done, and the moving picture industry in part sort of grows with Hawaii. And we become one of the main venues you do moving pictures. And so what happens is all of this becomes part of this whole process. Now running parallel with movies is radio. And you have to remember, in the world that we exist, our Wi-Fi system and our phones and everything else like that, that doesn't exist in the first half of the 20th century. The way that most people interacted with the world outside was through radio. You would go to some place on the weekend, maybe, or something like that, to go see a movie. But the way that you consume stuff right into the early mid-1950s was through audio, through radio. Not surprisingly, what you find is that also is people involved in that industry, who of course only make money if people listen to the radio show, very quickly realize that the Hawaiian stereotype is a great marketing ploy for what you want to do. And you still see this music now. This becomes, when you look at Awana hula. Awana hula is oftentimes tied to what's called hapahaole music, which was largely written in New York and LA in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s for radio. And it's oftentimes what you see, the classic stuff that you see. We'll see this next time, or actually I'll send you a short video of Hawaii calls. So what you find is by the 1930s, 1940s, prior to World War II, is almost everywhere in the United States, and in fact, a lot of the world's population is listening to shows that in some way or shape or other portray themselves as having something to do with Hawaii, usually through sound, and also through movies. And so that reinforces all these stereotypes, because before they were just stereotypes that people would read an article about or hear from their neighbors about. Now they're hearing it in music, now they're seeing it in film, and these stereotypes get enormously powerful and also very, very constrained. The stereotypes become very, very tidy because everyone's reinforcing it. If you're a composer and you're writing a new piece of Hawai'i music in 1932, you're going to have to reflect the stereotypes that already exist, or else people are going to say, that's not Hawai'i, that's not how Hawaii actually is, because I know that because I listened to a song last week. Now, this all sort of hits its crux with this. In 1945, I can't remember the guy's name right now, Edwards, I think, gets the really clever idea of actually doing a radio show that has only Hawaiian stuff on it. So he gets local folks to talk sort of pidgin, but it's mainland views of pidgin. He has people doing stuff that sort of is like sounds of people, surfing or something like that. And most importantly, he has people singing. This becomes at its height before World War II, and then after World War II, right in the mid-70s. In the 1950s and 60s, 750 nations in the world carried this show. If you want to put it in a context to say YouTube, this would be like if you had a weekly video blog on YouTube and it gets like 14 million hits a session. This was one of the most popular radio shows on the planet. Almost everyone in the US mainland listened to Hawaii calls when it went up, I think it was for an hour once a week. And what that did is that just crystallized this whole view of what Hawaii was, both pre-World War II and of course after World War II, in this very tiny package of stereotypes. And in fact, their classic slogan they did right till the time they quit in 1975, the sound on the waves at the beach at Waikiki. And that's one reason why Waikiki becomes absolutely central to tourism, because all these folks were basically pushing Waikiki as where you do this. And because it was very hard to audibly do a volcano, more and more the Hawaii stereotype became the stereotype of Waikiki and the sounds of what the tourist would consider the Hawaiian existence, which of course has basically nothing to do with this place. So we'll stop with that. I think actually when we do Monday, I actually show you a little bit. It's just easier to show clips in the class than actually sending the videos to watch. So we'll see a couple of these because they're really fascinating to look when you realize how powerful they were as images. I think it's sort of easy now. We sort of really look at it, sort of like roll your eyes and go like, oh man, that's so retro. But at the time, they literally defined everything, including, among other things, just to finish, of course, this defines Florida, because Florida was a totally unattractive place to do as tourism because Florida had alligators. Florida was totally unattractive. It was just a swamp. So very quickly by the 1920s and 30s, what they do very cleverly in Florida is they market themselves as an alternate Hawaii. If you go to, I had to go to a meeting once in St. Petersburg, which is on the West Coast in Florida. And you go and there's Aloha Avenue. There's tiki torches all over the place. There was this weird miniature golf course. It was also like this really weird movie set Hawaii stuff from like 1950. And people are just sucking that stuff up. A lot of the hotels were basically looked exactly like a Hawaii theme. They'd have a palm thatch and they'd have luau's. It was like, what, 6,000 miles away from Hawaii. But there was nothing interesting about Florida. So Florida marketed itself as an easy to get alternative to Hawaii. And that's still how Florida markets itself in 2020 in a lot of cases. So Hawaii was such a powerful image that other places actually appropriated in a whole mess of really strange ways. And if you ever want to see this, or anyone wants to do this for the next of their critical thinking papers, take a look, Google something like tiki bars, T-I-K-I bar, and then also there were tiki restaurants. Hugely popular in the mainland in 50s, 60s, and they are really, really strange. Okay, so at that point we'll stop. Any questions about this stuff? I'll be giving you some short videos. We'll do those in class on Monday. It's more fun to actually just sort of jump and hop through them, have you guys suffer through 10 minutes of stuff. So we all set for Friday? Everyone's like, yeah, I'm more than ready, Bordner. Let's just stop this now. Okay. Well, if there's no questions, then I'll see you guys on Monday. So
Thank
take
you.
care. Have a good weekend.